friend. Thank you for being here. And thank members of the public that are viewing us wherever you are, in the comforts of your home or in your office, and I welcome that. So for the first order of business, I'd actually like to address an email that we received that I think was important feedback for the committee. And one was, they asked if we could reintroduce ourselves, and we're gonna do that in a minute. And the other piece was that we need to speak up, that there's some cases when people are listening remotely, that they're not hearing us, so I'm gonna ask that we use our, elevate our voices if we're quiet so people can. There's no microphones in this room, so we don't have that ability, so please be distinct. And the other piece that I thought was interesting was they asked a question about some of the jargon that we use. We talk about the MOU a lot, and the general public like, well, what's an MOU? So if possible, as much to avoid jargon, or if we're gonna use it multiple times, be able to explain MOU is Memorandum of Understanding, just so that the general public is able to understand where we're going and what we're doing, because it is all about transparency. So for the purpose of making sure they're public and for our members here, and we only have 90 minutes to get through a big agenda, I'm going to ask a favor, that you introduce yourself, but introduce yourself shortly, which means can you say your name and one thing that you're affiliated with, and be able to move on. And at some point in time, we'll talk about how we can get the public to know a little bit more about us, but for this case, so we can get moving through the agenda, just say who you are and your affiliation. And Ed, do you want to start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Benjamin Mann. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of Finance at the Maine Department of Health and Human Services.
Eric Small, I work for the Sanford Police Department.
Bruce Log, the Maine Prisoner Reentry Network.
Liz Blackwell-Moore, I'm the Public Health Director at Cumberland County Government.
Paul Vinsel, I'm a physician at Tri-County Mental Health Services.
Todd Brackett, I'm the Sheriff in Lincoln County.
Betsy Fitzgerald, Washington County Manager.
Cassidy Toole, Director of Harm Reduction Services in Northern Maine at Maine Access Points, and a person with lived experience.
My name is Courtney Gary Allen. I'm the Organizing Director for the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project, or MRAP for short. I'm also a person with lived experience of substance use here in Maine.
I'm Lydia Krebs. I'm a member of the Maine House of Representatives.
I'm Miles Willett. I'm a clinical supervisor for substance use and also a person with experience.
Kina Decker, I'm an infectious disease and addiction medicine physician in Portland, Maine.
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Everett from the Opportunity Alliance.
My name is Pat Kimball. I am retired after 30 years of working in the field of substance use disorders, and I'm the proud daughter of a man in long-term recovery.
My name is Brendan O'Neill. I'm Assistant Attorney General for the Maine Attorney General's Office.
My name's Haley Tranko. Make sure Brendan gets here. With the Attorney General's office.
And Gordon, we are quickly, the members of the public asked if we would quickly introduce ourselves. So if you would just say who you are and in what capacity you're here. We don't, well, just talk to the owl.
I'm Gordon Smith. I'm the State's Director of Opioid Response. I'm here as one of Governor Mills' 2 appointments to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So the first order of business, I am going to apologize to the committee because, again, we talked about being transparent and we neglected to let you know that we were asked to appear before Health and Human Services to give a brief presentation on who we were by the Attorney General's office. We didn't have a huge notice. It wasn't like we got it and they said, this date's open, can you be there? We quickly put a presentation together and we're going to go over part of that presentation today. But again, I apologize to the committee because you certainly were welcome to attend or watch us on the computer. I believe if you go on, you can watch it. They tape, don't they tape all the, so you can see it.
We'll circulate the link.
And it will circulate that link to you, but we apologize for not saying in advance.
I meant to send you an email and you addressed it in that committee, but I want to say it here too. Can we talk about the pieces of legislation that are Thank you. They're asking to include the Recovery Council funds.
Yeah, so it was interesting, Brandon just asked me, what was some of the questions that the committee asked us? And the one that stood out was, they are already seeing legislation that's earmarking these funds to support their bills. And they wanted to know whether they could do that. And the answer is, probably not, because that really doesn't meet the goal of the settlement funds, but we certainly want to work with them. I mean, we can have that conversation, but if there's a bill that's supporting a program that we as a committee think that is really wise use for our funds, then we need to look at that. But it is one of the things that we have to keep an eye on as to who and what is requesting the funds and for what they're requesting those funds for. But that was the one question that stood out for the both of us, was like, whoa, that went quick. Someone's now got bills with the funds tagged to it.
I just wanted to, point clarity. So the legislation I'm hearing can't say the Maine Recovery Council will fund this bill, but could it say the Department of Health and Human Services will request that the Maine Recovery Council fund this bill? It sounds like an unfunded mandate because, I mean, I'm not saying that we will or will not support said bill. I'm just saying that it's an unfunded mandate.
Our office and the Attorney General's talked about this as well, reviews legislation generally that affects our clients and parts of the government generally. And we have already talked about legislation affecting the Recovery Council and the Recovery Fund coming through our office that we would evaluate and work on and advise both the legislature and the Attorney General about the legality of it and try to work with all the parties to find the right path forward on that. So part of the answer is in the process of reviewing the legislation, the Attorney General and I'm sure, I'm guessing I'll be involved, but others will be involved. We'll try to figure out the right way for the interests that are being expressed through the transparent process of the legislature to be brought to the attention of the Recovery Council so that a conversation can happen between the two groups, so that the legislature can learn about the work happening at the Recovery Council and also so that the council can learn about the things that the legislature is hearing and seeing and doing. So there is going to be that back and forth, and I think we're going to be involved. What the right language is at this time, I'm not 100% sure, but as we go through the process, we're going to be working on that.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
I also will point out that in the MOU, there's a provision, and I'm happy to point it out, that contemplates a process by which when legislation moves through the legislature, there's a sort of interplay between the HHS committee and the committee of jurisdiction to gauge support for whatever the proposal is. And then, that if it has sufficient support at those committees, that it comes to the council for consideration. So that's an additional method of conversation that we'll have.
Thank you.
And I know Courtney was there, thank you. And again, we apologize that it did not go out to the full membership. We just, as said, we didn't have much of a lead time, and so it's one of those things that we learned. And again, it's all about transparency and getting that message out. So.
We'll circulate the link afterwards, and many of you probably already know how to find it better than I do. For further transparency, I presented a truncated set of slides that you all saw in the December 20th meeting, and my job was to explain the settlements, which I think you've heard before, probably endless times. So a lot of it won't be news to you, and it also covered the scope beyond just the Recovery Council. It covered the settlements generally. The one question that I recall that stood out for me was really a suggestion. I think I was talking about the council's role in helping coordinate sort of collaboration among the state, subdivisions, non-governmental organizations, and so on. The suggestion was made that that collaboration might, especially in certain parts of the state, might be effective happening countywide, rather than like among 2 or 3 jurisdictions, and things like that. So, but again, you can watch the video. It's not exciting, but there it is.
And again, there were a lot of questions that they asked, particularly about their own districts. How much money did their district get? What are they doing? And that's what we told them. This council really doesn't tell the other cities what to do with their funds. And again, but that's the lesson we're going to try to do, is how do we coordinate that? How do we work together so that funds aren't duplicated in certain areas? And so that was that part of that question that said, is there some way that we can get together so that cities and towns can coordinate with this council as to how they use their funding? And particularly around data, and particularly around duplication of services.
There was interest, as you might imagine, in which communities have already received funding. And, you know, I explained how they could learn that information. I held up the very dense table of estimated spending that in the moment they didn't want. But, you know, I made it clear that, you know, how they could find that information.
Yeah, they were already looking it up when they were sitting at their desks, so it was good. It's a good conversation. So thank you very much for understanding, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, so for some procedural things for the meeting, we need to approve the December 20 minutes, which you all should have been able to review and get a copy of.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the minutes? If not, I take a vote on approving the December 20 minutes of the Maine Recovery Council. All in favor, raise your hands. Any opposed? Any abstention? For those listening in, the vote was unanimous. Thank you. January 31st minutes were the minutes of the bylaw committee, and that would not include the whole committee. That would just include those who were present. The January 31st ad hoc bylaw committee that was held, which would have been Courtney, Gordon, Chastity, and myself.
Motion to approve the minute.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on those minutes?
I have just a discussion, not so much on the minutes, but I didn't see where they discussed conflict of interest.
We did not. That is, when we get to the part where we talk about the bylaws, right now, it's a complicated issue, and that part is not been drafted out for us to look at, and that's why it's not. It's a big thing and a delicate thing. It's Maine and it's small, and we have to seriously look at how we are and how that's worded for conflict of interest. So, but thank you. All right, if there's no other discussion, I take a vote to accept the ad hoc January 31st meeting of the bylaw committee. Any opposed? None opposed. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Thank you all for doing that. All right. So as you know by the minutes on the 31st, the bylaws committee met. I thought it was, just for me, my opinion, a very productive meeting. And we made some changes, and we have a draft here that we're going to look at today, and we may vote on it, may not, depending on how this discussion goes. And I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
Okay, I'll just hit what I think are the sort of summary highlights. And other members who are present should feel free to interrupt me or let me know if I missed something, or other members of the council should ask questions. In section, the first issue is in section 2.2, there was a discussion about any needs assessment work the council may do. There was a discussion about whether that was really needed in the bylaws. And ultimately, as the minutes reflect, there was agreement to change the language in section 2.2 to permit the council to use, as it states, where appropriate, existing assessments that were performed within the last 2 years. And it was also changed to include that the council shall consult with stakeholders and the public on the methodology, findings, and conclusions of any needs assessment. Let's see, in Article 4, there was a discussion about, as I noted, how to include the public in the council's meetings. Part of the discussion was about whether to have at least one meeting a year in which the public can contribute. And that we added language, the group added language in section 4.2 at the end to reflect that at least one meeting each year shall include a public forum through which the council can receive input from the stakeholders and the public. So to back up a little bit, again, the council is required to meet twice a year. It can meet as many more times than that it wishes. It has to, at least one of those meetings has to be a meeting in which this public forum can happen. There was a separate discussion about whether the council, or it's really part of it, should include input from the public at each meeting, whether to have a segment of each meeting to include input from the public. The group's decision, as I noted at the time, was not to include that requirement in the bylaws, but that it was a good idea that the council might consider. I discussed briefly in section 4.6, which is the notice of meetings. I sort of discussed how our office is notifying the public of the council's meetings, and that the methods that we're using are probably blunt and may not be the most effective, and to invite input from the council about how to improve or contribute to making sure the public and interested parties are aware of the council's activities. The other big issue started to come up in Article 6. Again, discussion about members of the public and whether to have a public advisory committee, for example, or whether to include members of the public on committees. Ultimately, it was decided not to build in that requirement into the bylaws, and the group discussed the fact that the council in section 6.1 and 6.7 can determine whether or not to create other committees other than the ones listed here. So the council has sufficient flexibility for that. Then the other issue that came up was under 6.4, whether the governance committee of the council ought to include a certain minimum representation of particular interests that are of members that are in the council. Ultimately, the decision was made to not require such a minimum requirement, but to include in section 6.2 a requirement that the chair, in appointing committee members, take into consideration the diverse interests represented in the council. Those are sort of the big issues. The one other thing I'll point out is in section 8.3, council communications, we've talked about this before, using the info.recovery council inbox as a way to record the business of the council. Just a point of clarification on that. If you use that, if you add that email address in the CC line of your emails, it won't trigger forwarding of that email to everybody. If you put it in the to line, everybody will get that same email again. Or, if you, for example, if you put all the council members in the to line and the info box, I think you'll all get it twice. But if you put the info box in just the CC line, you won't get it twice, but it will go to the info box. Yeah. So that's today. Other members who were there, anything you want to contribute? Clarify?
Questions, concerns?
Oh, and Dr. Bensel, just to address, so there's a section that's reserved, Article 7 for conflicts of interest. I've got that work underway. I've got some additional things to work out in that provision, so that's why I didn't include it. It's its own conversation anyway, and it's worth not trying to have that at the same time as the bylaws.
I made a very important discovery in Article 3, Section 3.
I'm gonna hate this.
Uh-oh, what you got?
3.3, I think shall give written notice. Is that a typo? Shall give written notify.
3.3.
Minor.
Yes.
Yeah, 2.3.
Thank you.
I was so impressed with myself that I found it.
It's that attention to detail. I'm the worst speller in the world, so it's like, never pick that up.
I also have sort of like a small, I'm sure there are, it looks great. I'm wondering if in the spirit of ensuring that we're being inclusive, if it's possible to change some of the language from he, she to they, or he, she, they. I just think we're leaving out folks who use they, them pronouns when we don't have it in here. So the more we can do that up front, it's better. Somebody who uses those pronouns doesn't feel left out.
Any other comments, questions? Are you ready to vote on it? With the changes that have been suggested? So I've had two changes. One is a typo or a word change, and the other is that we change the use of our language in regards to he, she, they.
Motion to move the bylaws as amended.
Second. Do I hear a second? Did you say? Okay, we got a second. All right. Any further discussion on the bylaws?
On page 1, there's a short phrase that's in parentheses as well, in brackets.
Right, that's, so as part of the preparation for today, I've been reading or revisiting the last few meetings, and I recall at the December meeting, there was a discussion about how the council will distribute its funds. That was a placeholder for me until I had done my research about the process by which the council will distribute its funds. So, I mean, I think I would just strike, I would strike grants and just put distribution of funds to encompass like any possibility of how we would do this. That makes sense.
So are you changing this language?
It's this last paragraph under section 2.1. There's a section, the phrase in brackets,
Okay.
grants / distribution of funds. So we just remove the brackets and delete grants and /.
Can you add that to your motion, Clary?
Yes. Do I need to revoke the motion? I'll just add that to the motion.
Okay, we're gonna add that to the motion.
Okay.
So the motion is going, and we'll make sure, motion's going that we change the section 3.3, the word noted. We're going to take the parentheses out of section 2.1 under grants and distribution and revert all the language so it appropriately encompasses he, she, and they.
Motion should do that as amended.
Okay, and we'll second that motion. Further discussion. That's a lot easier than I thought. All right, all in favor, raise your hand, please. All right, any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, for those who are listening or watching, note that it was a unanimous decision with those minor changes that the bylaws are written, and as we stated, there'll be another section where we'll discuss conflict of interest. and review that policy. And that will be added to the bylaws when that is ready and hopefully soon. And the question I have to you is, do you want another subcommittee in regards to the conflict of interest? Do you want to use the same committee that we used for the bylaws to review?
My recommendation would be that now that there are bylaws that have a process for establishing committees, that one of the committees that establishes is the governance committee.
Okay,
I think a next step, not necessarily right now, is committees have to be formed and staffed, and the governance committee plays a role in electing or nominating officers, and so I think it's, now that there are bylaws, the council, would sort of move through that process of, appointing people to, forming committees, appointing people, and coming up with nominations for officers. So, that's, I'm not suggesting we do that right now, but I think talk about it and figure out how to accomplish that for the next meeting.
I think that is an agenda item for the next meeting, make sure people get material needed to make those decisions. All right. Any further discussion about the bylaws, conflict of interest? And again, the next step is now that it's approved, the bylaws are approved, then we have to get, as you said, the committees in place and start that moving forward, the election, permanent election of officers. And hopefully we'll have the material to you in the next meeting. We'll be able to start moving forward with that. Make sense to everyone? All right. Okay, thank you. All right. Presentation.
I hope this will be the last of my sort of orientation presentations. I know you've heard from me a number of times, and I appreciate your patience on this. Today's discussion will be about the approved uses of the funds and about required reporting. Much of the presentation is carryover from prior ones. You all have the slide deck in front of you because some of it will get a little bit dense. And if you have with you the original MOU of the background documents, we're going to be talking about exhibits 1 and 2 to the MOU, which are the approved uses. And I recommend looking mostly just at exhibit 2. So again, I've just, so the, what are you going to use? Again, just to have it in place, there's the council's role functions. In terms of the approved uses, the MOU in defining the approved uses talks about that opioid funds shall be used for the approved uses. Those are exhibits 1 and 2 of the MOU. And turning to, again, I recommend exhibit 2. It's broken out into 2 schedules. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, just copied really from the settlements, which is, and it's exhibit E in the distributor settlement, and it should be exhibit E in all of them. The approved uses are broken out into 2 schedules. Schedule A is core strategies, and the statement there is that priority shall be given to the following core abatement strategies. Schedule B is the full menu of possibilities. And in particular, it starts off by saying that there's a directive that the funds be used for evidence-based or evidence-informed programs and activities. Schedule A, my understanding is it's derived from Schedule B, and so it's intended to be a shorter list of those high-impact activities and programs that the settlement negotiators wanted to emphasize that parties focus on. In some places, in some states around the country, they have built their version of the Recovery Council to say, anything you want to do in Schedule A, go for it. Schedule B, though, you have to go through more of a planning process involving stakeholder input and doing more of a needs assessment, that kind of thing. So again, Schedule A, I think, is sort of the higher impact activities in Schedule B. Schedule B provides for a broader list of options. But I think my concern is the challenge in Schedule B is, especially if one is trying to implement the settlement in a local community, that person or that team may not have a working knowledge of what it means for something to be evidence-based or evidence-informed. And so on the AG's website, can you go back one page? On the AG's website, again, as I pointed out, we have the resources link for those who are trying to implement the opioid settlements. And then within the resources page, there's a variety of toolkits and other information, many of which talk about evidence-based programs. At the bottom of the web page is two sources of finding information about evidence-based uses. And can you click on the first one? The first one is, can you scroll down a bit? Okay, so the first one is a web page from the Federal Department of Health and Human Services from SAMHSA, which I can never remember what that stands for. I'm sure Gordon might be able to, but this is a federal website that purports to provide information about evidence-based programs. I've looked through it a little bit, but I'm a lawyer, I'm not a public health person. So if I'm in some community around the state trying to figure out what to do with this website, I don't have much ability to determine, how to sort of go through this and figure out what would be best in my local community. Like I wouldn't know, for example, of all the resources on here, which one is the most evidence-based? Is that even a useful way to look at it? Are there, which ones are evidence-informed? What does that mean? How do I evaluate whether somebody is applying for funds, whether it's an evidence-based use or an evidence-informed use? And so I highlight it because it's a role that this council might be able to play in providing assistance around the state for, as it goes about its both distribution of funds, but also collaboration process, to try to provide some help to people in local communities as they try to sort through what are the best ways we can use these funds. What's the most bang for the buck or impact we can have from using these funds? How the council, does that is, I think, up to you. But I just want to highlight that there are resources available. They may not be user-friendly, and there may be a benefit from the council finding a way to help people make better use of this information that's out there. Oh, actually, go back one and click on the other one. So that's the federal website from SAMHSA. There may be other collections of programs that are evidence-based. I figured that was a good one to start with. This is another resource that I came across looking at other programs. And so this is a document you can look at in your spare time that purports to focus evidence-based strategies on opioid abatement crisis.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just tell me how Exhibit A was chosen in terms of, because, I come from my view of what are like sort of the most effective and have the biggest bang for the buck. So I'm curious how these were chosen. Were they chosen at the state level, or were they chosen nationally as Exhibit A items?
When you say the state level, do you mean here in Maine?
Yeah, did you all determine what were Exhibit A items, or were they chosen at the national level of what's Exhibit B and what's Exhibit A?
Were they part of the settlement?
So we're talking about Schedule A and B here?
Yes.
So
Schedule A and B, sorry, not not Exhibit.
So I was part of. So let me back up. our office participated in different parts of the negotiations and the work around the investigations of litigation and the settlement. A lot of that I can't go into detail about because of confidentiality, because it was part of litigation. In general, I can tell you that my understanding is that so the settlements were negotiated among all the different parties to the litigation, which included, state AG offices, attorneys for local subdivisions, such as those here, the defendants, attorneys for school districts and other special districts. And so those groups got together and negotiated these. And putting this part of the settlement together, my belief is that the different parties consulted with experts back in their home jurisdiction, or perhaps with national experts. And so, so the people around the table, my expectation were probably attorneys, but my belief is that they were having their work informed by people they were consulting with, for example, at their own DHHS or, national academics or experts.
So every state has the same Schedule A and B, it's not different by state, what
That's right.
made into A, okay, that's what I was asking.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
So every state that is signed on to the settlement has the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maine didn't determine them. When we signed on, we said yes.
Got it.
But we did not determine them.
Yeah, great, that's helpful, thanks.
Do you envision that changing though, or not do you have a crystal ball? I think this is a very complicated piece of the puzzle, these evidence-based practices, and they make funding smaller organizations really hard to measure. And so I think as we think about distributing funds, I think we have expertise just listening to this conversation before the meeting started in the room, that I think we really need to understand the evidence-based practices as it relates to the distribution of funds, just in the spirit of sort of helping people and making sure the money lands at the right places. So I don't know where that would fit into this conversation. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but.
I think it's fine to have that conversation. Yeah. I mean, that's part of what we're talking about.
I think I agree with you. I mean, part of what we're doing, hopefully, is when we explore the data in Maine, and we hear what's going on, and we look and say, there's a gap. And that gap may not be in Schedule A, the gap may be in Schedule B. And I'm assuming as a council, we're gonna say, well, that's great, but we have the right to go to B and look at that. I mean, because I'm looking, you hear, and I'm just pulling it out of our hat. I'm not saying that. I'm looking at, if you look at B, support for treatment and recovery in regards to housing, and a lot of that's in Section B. And we know that in Maine, it's one of the places we've been very successful in, but we want to move forward in recovery homes and people. Again, I think that, and then, again, I'm just one person. I agree that nationally, I get it, and we're probably, pretty much common with the rest of the nation. But as we look at our own data and we see and hear what's going on in the state, we're gonna put the funding where we as a group think will help and support people receiving treatment and recovery. Other questions or concerns about those schedules the way they are and how we move forward?
So there is no requirement in Maine to stay in Schedule A. We could go into Schedule B.
Right.
Because our language of terms didn't require that of us.
That's right. The MOU requires that the funds be spent on approved uses. Approved uses include both Schedule A and Schedule B. Schedule A is a preference. It uses the word priority, and I think that's not a mandatory priority. It's more to make the most effective use of these funds. These are what states should focus on, or in states, communities, whoever gets the money. And also, it's worth noting, these approved uses are the same, the state as well as for the local communities that got money directly in Maine and nationwide.
One more question. So is it a requirement to fund evidence-based or evidence-informed?
Yeah, so I think the council will be sort of on the safest footing if it does that. The language of Schedule B says, the purpose of the uses is to support treatment of OUD and so forth through evidence-based or evidence-informed programs that may include but are not limited to the following. So evidence-based or evidence-informed is the sort of underlying focus of what the funds should be used for. And then, it lists these things. However, when I read through these, and again, as I mentioned, I'm a lawyer, not a public health person. A lot of the things in Schedule B do not seem to me like they might be evidence-based. So it's, there could be a use that's within Schedule B that may not be evidence-based. But I think that the strongest support for the council's work and for the work throughout Maine would be if the programs are evidence-based or evidence-informed.
Yeah, I just, sometimes when I think about evidence-based or evidence-informed, I think about who gets access to become evidence-based or evidence-informed, and it's often not marginalized communities. It's a really hard process to become evidence-based, but I understand, like, we're trying to say, like, do the things that work in the communities and not the things that don't work, because we're trying to, like, save lives with this money. We're trying to use the money in the way it's money that came from people dying from this disease. But so I understand that. I just want to make sure that the words evidence-based and evidence-informed have a lot of connotations that are built in privilege.
Yeah, an excellent point. I think of some of the things that are happening in the state that are very successful. I don't know if recovery homes are
I don't know either.
evidence-based, but we know that they're working,
Yeah.
and we know
They
that
are.
people are becoming successful.
And they're like, what about like culturally informed treatment that Wabanaki Public Health is
Correct.
doing for Indigenous communities? I don't know if that has met the level of evidence-based, but I know that it's helping folks in recovery.
But I guess that's the reason that they changed the language to add evidence informed, because I think it was a very long time, there was this real push for just evidence-based, and there was a lot of pushback that didn't allow for this room for cultural adaptations and creating culturally relevant things and creating things that we thought were gonna work, but we needed to try them out, right? Because we think they are based on this research that we have, but we need to actually do the work. And that, I think there's a very large net that evidence-informed holds.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing about evidence-based and evidence-informed, it depends on what your goal is. What are you testing for? Are you testing to save lives? Are you testing to extend lives? Are you testing to eliminate substance use? Those are all different things. So something might be evidence-based to save lives, but not to decrease use, or to save lives, but not to keep people in treatment longer. So we don't want evidence-based to eliminate our imagination.
That's what I was.
Yeah, I love, that's why, I love the way you just put that, because I think that's true. You don't want to discount something new that you think may save lives. I mean, we don't want to be that, at least for me. I don't think this committee wants to be that short-sighted that we just say, I'm sorry, that we just do evidence-based and then, but I love the way you just put that, Dr. Hassel. That was very well put. I do, I'm going to keep that in my head. I like that.
I also think as the council moves down the road of figuring out what the needs are, figuring out where the gaps are, and trying to come up with a plan for how to distribute funds, we can work, I think, together on trying to identify the parts of Schedule A and Schedule B that the council's work would fit into. And so, you know, I think it'll be, there's a lot of flexibility in there. It's, again, it's a menu. It's not designed to say you have to do X, Y, you have to do all of these things. When you get spread too thin, so I think that it would be part of our work together to, you know, try to find the best way to characterize, you know, is this, you know, found in the documents.
Just a point of clarification, I mean, the subheading for Schedule B says may include but not limited to.
Right.
So I don't know how we include other approved uses that aren't on Schedule A or Schedule B, but it seems to contemplate that as well.
Yeah, the language has, the settlement language has a lot of flexibility built into it, but it's also written in a way to try to encourage uses in these ways. You know, so like Schedule A is, you know, these are, you know, parties shall prioritize these things, but not required. You know, Schedule B is not limited to, you know, and so on. So there's flexibility, but the parties tried to write it, as I understand it, in a way to say, try to focus in these ways. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a lot of questions. But there's somewhere in this document that says you, not that I think this council would do it, but random town in US America. There's somewhere in this document that says you can't use it on roads and bridges and.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, there should be no recovery bridge.
No recovery bridges, America. Okay, got it.
Not having
Thank you.
Interstate 101.
Yeah.
We'll get into that in a few minutes.
And it can't go into the rainy day fund.
Any other questions about the approved uses at this time? Okay, next slide. All right, so reporting is an important topic, and it's probably dull, but it feeds into kind of the public health piece, it feeds into transparency, and it feeds into trying to put the funds to the best use possible. From the point of view of transparency, the memorandum of understanding, and I pointed this out to you before, requires the council to develop, you know, or I think contribute to an existing public dashboard or other repository of information about the expenditure data of the council's work. And this language here talks about the expenditure data from any party that receives the recovery funds. So as the council distributes its money, it has an obligation to collect information from the recipients of those funds. The council may require outcome-related data from any entity that receives recovery funds. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, that's probably a good idea. Some of the other reporting will ask for some of that information. Another part of the council's work is to help others collect and report data, outcomes, and strategies. And that's its role as facilitating collaboration around the state. Next slide. Now, the sort of hard reporting requirements are on this slide, and that's why you have the slide deck in front of you, because this gets a little dense. There's at least 5 points throughout the year when the council's work has to be reported to somebody. February 1st, the Attorney General just filed a report of the council's work with the Health and Human Services Committee. That's required by the statute that governs the council's work. That report has to describe the activities of the council, the status of the recovery fund, any disbursements, and any outcomes of funded activities. I've distributed that report to you. There wasn't much to report other than the status of the fund at this time. In September, the MOU requires that the council require its grantees to report back to the council how the grantees targeted funds to the approved uses. So it's meant to collect from its grantees that information. And then in October, the Attorney General has to compile those reports and just send them to the legislature. And then in December, on the second Friday, the Attorney General again reports to the legislature about the activity of the Recovery Fund, in particular to the Appropriations Committee and the Health and Human Services Committee. And then on December 31st every year, the Secretary of State requires all boards and commissions to file certain reports of their activities. And it's fairly detailed, not just about the board's, or in this case, the council's work, but also about the council's members. So, and we have filed this report on behalf of the committee with the Secretary of State's office. We have to identify who the clerk is, who the members are, the members' addresses, the dates of their terms, their compensation, any vacancies, meeting information about the meetings, and information about the council's expenses, and information about the council's activities. Questions about that slide?
Does Appropriation and Health and Human Services even meet in December?
I don't think I'm qualified.
They wouldn't, when you have to report to them.
You'd report to them, but you wouldn't.
Doesn't presume that they meet.
Oh, okay.
You send it over to them and they'll meet when they meet.
Yeah, I thought, they meet in December? Thank you.
The next slide talks about reporting to effectively the defendants in the settlements. And under the distributor J&J settlements, there's a requirement that a minimum of 85%, or in the case of J&J, 86.5% of the settlement funds be used on opioid remediation. This amounts over that can be used for non-opioid remediation amounts. That contemplates paying attorney's fees for the work that went into bringing these funds in. And so as long as the council is spending its funds on opioid remediation, it has nothing to report of non-opioid remediation uses. Our office would still have to file a report every 6 months, March 31st and September 30th, of whatever those non-opioid remediation uses are. They essentially relate to attorney's fees, whether it's fees related to the litigation and settlement work, or fees related to enforcing the settlements, carrying out the settlements. The MOU, for context, states that in Maine, all settlement funds have to be used for approved uses, which is the opioid remediation uses. The same MOU creates the backstop fund, which is supplemental attorney's fees. 7% comes out of the subdivision's 30% to create the backstop fund. If any of that 7% is not used for those attorney's fees, it goes back to the 30% pie and gets redistributed among the subdivisions. But it could be that that entire 7% pot goes to the attorney's fees, and that would need to be reported to the defendants under this provision. And that works out to be around 2% of the money that comes into the state as a whole. The other, I think, more detailed reporting requirement is in March. Every March 1st, for the Mallinckrodt bankruptcy, states have to report to the bankruptcy trustee the amounts received in the state, awards made in the state, in detail, including the recipient, the amount that was provided to that recipient, the program to be funded, and the disbursement terms, and then approved administrative expenses. And I want to point that out because that's more detailed than any other requirement. You don't see that in the MOU, you don't see that in the school's MOU, you don't see it in the statute, and you don't see it in the distributors of J&J. So, however, the proportion of funds we're talking about are very, very small. So if you turn, you could go to So if you go to the slide that shows the opioid settlement payments amount, proportionally, the Mallinckrodt payment that's going to come in over 9 years is quite small, but it's going to drive more significant reporting requirements. And that portion of funds, I think this year, Maine's going to receive just over $800,000 from the Mallinckrodt bankruptcy. So just over $400,000 will come to the Recovery Council to be distributed, at the time that the council, decides to. The reporting is for the prior calendar year. So March 1st of this year, the recipients have to report on any money they received in the prior calendar year. Maine didn't receive any Mallinckrodt money last year, so we don't have that reporting requirement this March 1st. But when March 1st next year rolls around, we will have that reporting requirement. And I think some thought will need to go into what to do with that money. Some options, at least that occur to me, are, that money could be segregated so that reporting requirements attach only to that segregated fund. Alternatively, the funds could be commingled and the reporting requirements could be followed through for all of the funds, just as a matter of practice. If that is determined to be, the best course of action. And that choice will need to be made by even the local governments in Maine who receive direct payments from the Mallinckrodt bankruptcy. But the point here is that those payments are going to be relatively small, but they're going to drive some of the reporting requirements more so than any other provision in any other settlement. And it's something to be aware of as the council moves forward with its procedures. Any questions?
If we commingle all the funds and then disperse them, we could make one report saying how much went to each place.
Right.
That report could go to everyone.
Right.
Instead of having to make two different reports.
Yes. So for example, under that scenario, my office would probably try, it would provide a list of, all of the places, all of the recipients of the funds, describe all the uses, and allocate, some proportion of the funds that the council distributed to Mallinckrodt and say, we're not going to try to trace the Mallinckrodt money through these distributions, but here's the reporting that we can provide that, meets the Mallinckrodt requirements. And there may be reasons for, public transparency or for public health reasons why the council may want to apply the Mallinckrodt reporting to all of its funds.
I was just going to mention that it might be worth considering, and I see it as one of the approved uses, setting aside at least a little bit of money for providing technical assistance for collecting evaluation data. I think, especially as you were mentioning, smaller organizations, it can be very hard for them to figure out exactly how to do all of that. And if we have funding, when you get this funding, you get some level of technical assistance to support that, could be really helpful.
And I think it sort of dovetails in my mind, but you all may feel differently, in the council's work, both for helping entities throughout the state collaborate, but also in this dashboard that it has to create and supply. If the council's going to be reporting on this public dashboard these particular uses for just this small chunk of change, you may consider that it may be worth it to report for others.
This is also a rabbit hole, but I think just in line with that, we're going to want to be mindful on reporting requirements, because unless we, for example, take in recovery homes, if we want to fund that, there's lots of contracts in place to fund recovery homes now, and we're going to be adding a portion of settlement funds onto other funds that are already funding that, and then we're going to require providers to just report or specially report on recovery council funds. It's going to get very complicated, which I deal with a lot at DHHS already. But so we're going to, whether it's just the Mallinckrodt piece or just overall reporting for this, we're going to need to that's a long conversation I think we're gonna need to have as well.
That strikes me as I mean, I'm sort of the layperson in the room. That strikes me as a complicated conversation. I wonder if there's a subgroup that we're community.
I think at some point in time, we're gonna have, and again, that's partly out of the AG's office, because they're the ones that ultimately have to report back. So if they're content with this recovery, with this council saying, we're gonna put all our money in one pocket and you can figure out the percentages from there, or is it our role to, again, it really depends on what the AG's office how they're going to report it. And I think this committee needs to have that, if I'm looking at it, they need to have that, we need to have that conversation with them as to how they're gonna see it. Because you could look at this amount and say, well, the Malachi one is 2% of the money. So we're gonna say in reporting that when we expended so much money, 2% of the money came from 10, and I can say that seems reasonable to me, but the AG's office may say, well, no, that's not how we want it done. So it's really, if I'm looking at this, it's their office that has to do the reporting. And so we're gonna have to design our program to be able, reporting programs to be able to match how they're gonna do it, or it's just gonna get too complicated. And part of my concern always is when we talk about small nonprofits and how that is making things simple for them to report so we get our data.
I think on that point, I will be paying attention to, and I'm the one who's probably going to be filling out these reports, like this Malachi report's due March 1st, and I'm going to be saying 0. So, I'm going to be hip deep in some of these reports, so I'll have some detail about those, so I can inform the council, about that work as we go along. But I would caution, I would not let, whatever the burden might be on our office drive the council's work. I would encourage the council to find the best use of the money, find the best way to collect information, find the best way to report, and we'll try to, unless we identify that that's gonna be a use that doesn't comply with the settlements, I think we can work to try to find a way to make the reporting work. And we can work with the parties. We want I think all the parties want to make sure that the funds get used and that there's transparency and that there's public involvement. And so I think we can work to make the council's work fit in the square peg in the round hole.
And this might be a slightly adjacent black hole kind of thing, but when I think about the nexus of reporting and small nonprofits and how we distribute funds, I think it's going to be really important for this council to consider, are we doing a reimbursement of funding, or are we doing a traditional kind of private grant to nonprofits? And why I think that is important as somebody who runs a small nonprofit and who has lots of friends who run small nonprofits, if we don't just kind of give them the money and I expect that they're going to use it the way that they have, trust them to use it the way that they have outlined to us in their proposal, you can't pay staff. You can't pay the bills if you don't have the money. So I just think that we got to really consider that as we decide how we're going to trust our partners in this work.
Again, I ran a small nonprofit for years. A lot of times when you look at grants, you say, okay, there's no way I can even apply for that grant because there's no way I can meet their requirements of just the data alone. In technology and how that interfaces. And those are things that I think that we'll have to have a real conversation with in regards to how do we do that.
Yeah, I am waiting for a check to become available in a checking account right now, and just had to delay my staff's payroll until next week because the check has not cleared, and we don't have the money to pay it until it does. So
I remember
that's those days. If you
I
want to
know.
fund small nonprofits, then you need to make sure that you're doing it in a way that gives them the money to do the good work you want them to do.
And part of that is allowing them to have funding for admin. So, yeah.
Yes.
Overhead costs.
Please.
Yeah.
Critical.
I mean, I mean, there's so many grants that won't allow for that. And so you're just tying the hands of them by saying, no, you can't use admin costs. Well, that's not a dirty word, admin. It's the things that help pay the bills and keep things moving forward. So those are things we want to be able to make sure. I mean, even when you look at this settlement funding, there's money in here to get administrative support for this committee. And at one point in time, we have to look at that as to how we use those funds for administrative purposes to be able for this committee to function appropriately with support. This year, man does so much work. I don't know how he gets anything else done in his office. So, and again, but we have that opportunity to use some of our funds to do that. Just a small portion, we don't need to do the.
I just want to ask a quick question about if we do decide to do this more detailed reporting, are the municipalities will they have to buy into that kind of idea? Or does that even have to happen?
They're separate.
They'll be completely separate.
I mean, it could implicate their work in the sense that, so the council, has to decide at some point, what it wants to target, who it wants to target, what parts of the state it wants to target, and so forth. Every entity in the state is eligible to receive these funds. The school districts that get 3% of these funds could also receive council funds beyond the 3%. Yeah, so subdivisions, a county, a city that received a direct chunk of change can receive additional, can apply to the council for additional. Or, a community that didn't receive a direct chunk of change can apply to the council for, so the council has work to do to figure out, who it wants to pay attention to. Having said that, in a scenario where say the council decides to apply these reporting requirements to all of its funds, if it makes a distribution to a subdivision that already got its own chunk of change, it probably should require that reporting about the council's chunk. And that subdivision will have to decide whether or not to apply that reporting requirement to its own money. So that, I think that's their choice.
Actually, it was one of the legislative questions they had was municipalities don't have the same requirements that this council necessarily does, and how can you coordinate that?
I was going to use your word, Pat, transparency. I think as more eyes are on this money, we're starting to see the emails coming in.
Yeah. Money.
Brendan, who is talking? Who's leading the exchange between the subdivisions, your office? Because I think there's a lot of emotion around this crisis, and so I think the data, the reporting. If we do it this way and this looks a certain way for municipality, I think that's tricky. So
I am doing the same, the talking that I'm doing to this council, and I apologize, I'm taking up so much of your time. I'm also doing to one of the three groups in the state that got a chunk of change, and that is the non-litigating subdivisions. Those that didn't hire outside counsel to investigate and litigate these cases. I am not having those conversations with the litigating school districts, and I'm not having those conversations with the litigating subdivisions, the cities, counties, and towns, because ethically, legally, I can't. They're represented by their own attorneys, and I'm about this matter. And my view at the moment, unless I sort of hear otherwise, is they have their counsel. I can't talk to them because they're separately represented. But I am having those conversations with the non-litigating subdivisions as the person in my office who is responsible for the zoning funds. So, but those are very administrative conversations, like you're about to get a chunk of change, here's how much it'll be, and I'll be talking to them about reporting requirements and things like that. But I'm probably doing more for this group than I am for for them, but there may be an opportunity, I don't know, anyway, yes.
Bruce and then board.
I don't want to get into the weeds of this too, but when you're receiving, especially federal funds, there's a technical advisor, and I kind of want to go along with what you were saying, there's no technical assistance. And certainly if there is technical assistance built into what we do, then maybe the municipalities would be more eager to, follow this and apply for grants that maybe might seem like, really scary. But we'll tell them, hey, we'll have technical assistance and we'll walk this journey with you.
That's kind of what I was thinking when I talked about the, section of the website about, evidence-based versus evidence-informed. I don't know what those mean. I'm hoping that somebody, provides that technical assistance to the community. So
And then.
you should,
Another place to look for that, that communication is, are the 4 individuals on our council who were appointed by the litigating subject. I'm not gonna speak for them, because I'm not one of those 4 people, but I do see that as one of the, when you think about, well, how can we try to get the biggest impact by people at least communicating, so that I want to know how they're spending their money, and there might be a time, I'm hoping there is, that we could communicate with them. We have to send a letter to their lawyers, that's fine. We presume they have enough to go out and pass it on to their clients, and we communicated with them about, do they have any needs, informationally that we could help with. I mean, that may be my first approach, and by the way, could you share with us how you're spending your money, so that we're not duplicating. There's got to be a way here in the next few months, with the help of the 4 people that represent them, to avoid duplication and to work together. I mean, we're not at that point yet. I'm very impressed. I didn't know you were meeting with the non-litigating subdivision. That's terrific. That's a big positive thing.
I called them and I warned them when they were gonna get a check, and
We have a spreadsheet.
like we're not meeting with them, but we're having, like, I call them and I tell them that things are happening and what to expect.
Can you remind me of the 39, how many are non-litigating subdivisions?
16.
16.
16,
16.
not litigating.
So I just want to mention, it feels like this is a timely moment. So to just mention, so I am the public health director in Cumberland County. Cumberland County has 9 of the towns that are on this list that are receiving funds. And we ourselves are also receiving funds. So we were having conversations because towns were asking us, what should we do with this money? Can you help us? We know we have some ideas, but we want to make sure that we're not duplicating. I just want to confirm to you all that they're having the same conversation that we are having here of, like, how do we make sure we're being collaborative and coordinating, at least these 9 towns and us. I can't speak for the other 12, but that's really a concern. And so we had a meeting in which we invited them to come and ask them, what can we do to support you? This is kind of what a county public health department could do, right? We can help you if you're interested in that. And they said, yes. They said, please, we would love that. So I've created a spreadsheet that we now are requesting lots of information from folks in prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and recovery, in which we're trying to get sort of a comprehensive, which we've done before. We did in 2017 through a different project that was funded through Gordon, actually, with this municipalities addressing addiction. So we have like a 2017 baseline, and now we have we're gathering this information to say to the towns, okay, here's what we think we know is happening in these places, and then invite some folks from prevention, harm reduction, and treatment recovery to speak with them about what they feel like are some of the key things, to then be able to support them with some of that technical assistance. And if they would like, we can do some supportive, we can do collaborative spending, we can do coordinated. I think the idea is coordination over anything else. If it creates collaborations where they want to pool the funds to do something, we'll do that as well. But I felt like this was a moment to tell you that that's sort of a sub thing that I'm doing that I think as a part of my job, but I think it plays in that we could perhaps talk to the other counties about, if you have towns, they don't have someone like me, but we do have public health people who are, whether they're the prevention person or whether they're the, director of a public health program, they may really be willing to do some of that work as well, and may already be doing it.
And Liz, you should know that for those municipalities that are among the non-litigating subdivisions, I've pointed them to this website that has the resources. Resources is not, a website is not the same as technical assistance, I get it.
Right.
What do I mean? But they at least have access to that information or are aware of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just along the same lines for the smaller subdivisions or those subdivisions that had smaller awards who are struggling with what to do and how to do it. Is it, as this progresses, is that if a subdivision wanted, I don't know what the right word is, I'll use Lincoln County as an example, if they want to partner with the council to piggyback on initiatives within that subdivision, kind of the same model that Cumberland County sounds like they're using, I don't know how that would work, especially if the council is gonna have a piece of a technical assistance piece that we may not be able to provide. So it's nothing that would prevent those kind of things.
Yeah.
But already, so like, they know I'm on the council, right? They're like, oh, what do we do? What should we do here? Just, put it in the bag.
Yeah, put it in the bag, just put it in that rainy day fund. I think, for me, when I think of that, I sometimes think, oh, the council isn't at that point. We were trying to figure out where we are as ourselves, but again, joining smaller towns, trying to join with larger ones that may get that help. I'm thinking I live in Bangor, so I know that Bangor's been discussing their funds, but other smaller towns may have gotten some money, and how can they join together to, effectively make change and share that piece. But I think that, eventually the council's role, I would see, is trying to help coordinate with all of the state in some way to be able to best produce prevention, treatment, and recovery services here. But I sometimes, it's very idealistic, but I think in my head, I'm like, well, the committee has so much work to do, add that to it. But for me, I see it more at this point. If I was in a small town and receiving money, I would be encouraging my small town to maybe call the larger towns and say, what are you doing? Because they may not even know either. So, it really is, everyone, I said to the legislature, it's the first time in my life I've ever been fighting over that we have money. This has just never happened in my 30 some odd plus years of working in this field. It's a pleasant thing to have, but you want to spend it right. You just don't want to, like, you've won the mega bucks and you don't just want to go out and buy a fancy new car. You want to figure out how it's going to last.
I don't know if anybody knows the answers to this question, but many counties and cities across Maine got money like they've never seen before through the ARPA funding.
Oh, yeah.
And so many cities and towns hired a consultant to help them figure that out. Could that a consultant be helpful to them? Like, could they do the same thing that they did with this mass influx of ARPA funding? Or even the same consultant, hypothetically?
I was actually thinking, Courtney, I wonder if there's a way to think about this. There's a section in here around coordination. And so I actually wonder if we think about it as the possibility of actually giving grants to those who already have some infrastructure for public health to be the coordinators for the public health district or for something that is doing some of that work of creating coordination and collaboration between entities and supporting that work. So I'm funded, my role is funded through county taxes. It's not through any grants or anything, and I'm super unique in that way. And so everybody else who does public health most people are, unless you're Portland Public Health or Bangor Public Health, you're funded through a very specific grant. So adding on a new role, and requires funding. And so you could hire a consultant, but you could actually, this is 18 years, you could help people have additional capacity within their organization to be the ones to do that coordination that they already do on this topic. So I think there's lots of ways to do it. I guess I'm just suggesting that could be one.
So I just have to ask, oh, sorry.
I'm just gonna give you a reminder, you only have about 15 more minutes to 2:30. I don't know if you wanna go longer than 2:30, but we only have about 15 more minutes to 2:30.
I have a procedure question, and I know it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it's an important one. I think of Liz, you and I, our jobs, people are gonna start coming to us.
Oh, yeah.
So procedurally, how do we manage that? And you all, just again, listen to the conversation. So people are gonna start seeing us and our communities as the resource. So procedurally, I missed last month, so any wisdom around that, Madam Chair?
The wisdom, I think that we talked a little about it last week, that, again, the hard part is, when I'm alone, I'm not the recovery council. I'm only the recovery council when I'm sitting in this room with the recovery council. So any member can't speak of the role of the council other than that we know is part. We can speak as our role as we see it, and share the information around that. And again, encourage them, like I've already seen it on the public website. There's people throwing ideas, saying, I think this is, and I think that's what we encourage people to do, to talk about it. Well, we talk about it, I always look at any conversation about substance use disorders starts to eliminate stigma, because it's open, it's discussion, it's there, it's real, it's here. So that, for me, that's just me. But again, and we talked a little bit about it last meeting, just to be cautious about one person doesn't make the sole decisions, but you can say, I love that, I'm gonna bring that back to the council. Those are the things we can do until we can get to a point where we have some more formality about, again, you saw it in the bylaws, you've heard it here, how do we get into the public and be able to start getting the public feedback that we're looking for, other than the emails and people listening to us. But I think we'll get there, it's just slow and steady. So, I don't know if that answers.
That's great, thank you.
Let me just-
Derail your question, about time. It's urban.
Let me just wrap this section up. I just wanted to put back up the last bullet in your slide deck. Talks about the Recovery Council shall facilitate collaboration among the state, subdivisions, regional councils, and other stakeholders for the purpose of sharing data, outcomes, and strategies. And so that is the council's, it's one of the council's jobs. And so I think that's an appropriate thing for the council to talk about how to do. The rest of my slide deck is a repeat of the December one. There's information in here about the time periods of the settlements and when they'll pay out. The longest time period is 18 years. Some of the other settlements will pay out during that time frame. There's a slide about how much money to expect from the settlements. I'll point out again that there's information here about the new settlements, Walmart, Devon and Allegan, CVS, and Walgreens. Two things about that is, three things. Those numbers are for statewide. They're the maximum amounts that the state would be eligible to receive if everybody signs up. So all of the litigating subdivisions, all of the non-litigating subdivisions, and all of the litigating school districts. So that's what that number represents. One of the numbers is slightly lower than it should be. The CVS and Walgreens number is really 52 million or so. And I'm sorry for that error. And I haven't filled out the rest of the boxes in that chart because there isn't yet an MOU that allocates the money around the state.
I have to laugh, the speakers on my phone, and you said Walmart. It pops up the closest Walmart on my phone.
That's terrifying.
I shut the speaker off. I thought, what? Why is my phone flashing Walmart?
You've seen the other slides with the maps before. Those numbers haven't changed as far as I know. And it's just the websites and information.
Questions?
comment really that until the legislative presentation, I had really misconstrued that last slide on the total amount, the payments to the counties, cities, and towns. I mean, I guess I should have taken that more literally. And I had misspoke at a few places that I assumed that the amount next to the counties was the amount that came to the county. Now, and it's not, because I think Brendan correctly, he's loaded in the towns and cities amounts in those counties. So like in Betsy's case, she's got, there's at least one town in Calais that got payment. So to know what's being held in Washington County now, you'd have to get $150,000 minus whatever Calais' checks were. So I, maybe all the rest of you absolutely understood that. I did not, and I probably overstated to some people that, hey, your county's got,
No wonder I'm getting some.
you know, 100.
Don't spend that money yet.
Thankfully, in a few cases, I was right, because like in Somerset County, I don't think there's a single subdivision large enough so the whole amount, $158,000 is being, it's actually 157, is being held in Somerset County. But I want to make sure nobody else made the same mistake.
And you can get the breakdowns on the website in the more detailed, dense charts. And I haven't said it before, this chart is thanks to the work of David. So.
Any other questions? This is my simplistic goal. I just want to know how much money we have to spend this year.
So,
That's what I would like to know. At some point in time, I'd like a budget for exactly how much money can this council distribute this year?
So the council, for what a small point here, the council can spend less than the amount of money it has. It can't spend more than it has, which is obvious. But there's no requirement that it spend all of its money in any given time period.
No.
14 million. That would be the.
What's that?
That's
It's
wow,
it's
right now.
Yeah, it's 14
Right now,
million.
it's 14 million.
Well, that depends upon what you mean by the year. So, because if you meant 2023,
Right.
this year, by the end of December, we'll have the second year's payments in hand. So you know, the money trickles in at different times of the year.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. So
Okay.
it's no less than 14.3 million.
So when I look at it, if we get to the point where we have a process for grants, how much money are we actually allocating? We don't want to allocate more than we have, but we also don't want to, you know, we don't want to have this big bank account. Nothing wrong with a big bank account. I've never had one, but, okay.
By the way, my point about the Mallinckrodt money, so the $14 million that the recovery fund has now, the Mallinckrodt money would, I'm estimating it to be over 400,000 for this year. So that will drive that reporting requirement, because that was that.
Any more questions on that? I'm looking at my watch here. It is 2:30, but I would like to have a discussion. We talked about at the last meeting about a retreat meeting. And we talked about it being anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. And we talked about, we have funding to pay for an outside facilitator. I talked with Brendan, and I reached out to someone I knew that was in the business of doing strategic planning, and she actually submitted a proposal. And I'm wondering if you want me to reach out to somebody else and have a couple proposals that we look at as to who that facilitator is. And if you have recommendations of somebody that you used and you would like to see that, if you would get them to myself or to Brandon, and we can explore that. The current person that I reached out to, her suggestion was she would actually meet with the executive committee for an hour. Then she would survey the board with key questions. Then she'd review those questions with the executive board to result the finalized agenda for the retreat, and the retreat go for like 3 or 4 hours. So what I will do for you is I will, if you get me the names, I will submit what our proposal is, and then we can look at all of them and determine what we would like to do.
Fred Miles, because he doesn't speak as much.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So this is extra money that we have to pay for?
This is part of,
Facilitator to
yeah,
get us to know each other? Is that?
well, it's actually to get us really jump-started. And that will be part of the question is, what is the goal that this committee wants for this retreat? Do we want to start looking at how do we approach the grant process? How do we, move forward as a group and sort of start that jumpstart the getting into this distribution of funds, what we look like. And so we talked about it and getting an outside facilitator, that way they keep us on task. Everybody gets to participate. For instance, if you're chairing that committee, you're usually not able to participate as much as everybody else. They're taking notes, they strategize it, they submit a report to you at the end, and then we have it. But we have, as I said before, we have some administrative funds out of the 14 million that we could use to hire this kind of person to be able to, and we don't know, we may want to look at a budget. They can be short-term, which they just come for this one time, or it may be someone that you want to say strategically throughout the year, we want to hire this person 2 or 3, a couple times to be able to make sure we're keeping task, making our goals. But this would really help us set up our goals, our vision, how we make our decisions, funding, that kind of work. But it would be someone who specializes in strategic planning.
Just keep in mind, depending on where we go, we're gonna need some kind of money to rent a room, potentially. We don't wanna be investing.
I don't see how we do that without knowing what is the goal of that particular retreat for those 4 days. We have some substantial informational needs, such as where's the money being spent now, so that we'll be able to intelligently determine the problem of supplant versus supplement. And that is a big discussion. The tens of millions of dollars that are spent on this work in Maine now, and we need to learn where that all is. We also have to learn a lot about granting and somewhat about procurement. Those aren't things that, honestly, you're a good facilitator. I'm not interested in paying somebody to facilitate those discussions.
Correct.
If there's something more about how we do our work and stuff like that, I mean, I could tolerate. Because, I mean, you know what I'm gonna say there. When 716 people are dying, I'm gonna be less tolerant of doing the touchy-feely thing. Oh, I need to get to know you. I know all of you. I want to spend the money wisely, and there's some things that absolutely we need to do, and I support longer meetings because it's gonna take that long. But I feel a lot of pressure to get this money to people that it's designed to help.
I absolutely 100% agree with you, Gordon.
I actually very much agree with Gordon right now.
Yeah.
And,
Ditto.
yeah, and I also want to be very careful about I understand that we're not experts in everything around this table, but there are some leaders from our communities across the state of Maine at this table right now who have lots of expertise about all of things. So just being careful, I think there's a very important line between going too fast with this money and taking way too long.
Correct.
Because there's lots of people dying and lots of community organizations that needed this money 2 decades ago, and they're waiting. So
I absolutely, and that's part of, again, trying to figure out how do we get what we need to do to get this money where it needs to go. And what is that step that's absolutely crucial for us to do? And I'm with Gordon. I would love to get to know all of you, whatever, but I think I want to do it in the trenches.
Maine is a small town. Maine is a small town. We've got lots of places to do that.
You know, and that's what I think I'd like, you know, and you do, I know from my own work, I get to know people when you're down in those trenches, figuring out how to do it, and you get to learn who those natural born, who the people are who rise as leaders, and who are the doers, and who, you know, how that goes. So I guess what I'm looking for is that retreat, so I'm hearing you, that retreat needs to be focused on work. How do we get this grant process moving forward?
I guess I wonder if I guess you're suggesting that perhaps there's a facilitator, but I guess we could really hone in on what are the needs that we have at that meeting. And I agree, we need to know who's doing what now, and can this facilitator do some of that background work to figure out who can prepare things. There's the state, you know, DHHS and CDC and OVH, they fund a ton of stuff. So can this person say, we need these documents to figure out what's happening? Do we require a facilitator to do that? If we do, great, let's do it. If we don't, and we can just get the state offices to provide the information of who gets funded to do what now, and then we figure out who presents to us if we need it. And I agree with you, we've got a ton of
So
the people here that
yeah,
can do the work.
a facilitator isn't gonna come in and tell you what you need to know. A facilitator is really to get you moving, so.
Yeah, but I guess I'm suggesting I would only like to have a facilitator if they're gonna go ask the people for the information and get the people to come in to present what we need. If we need a facilitator, and so that might be somebody who has a broader knowledge of this issue and the problem and who to talk to, as opposed to facilitating the day. But do all the upfront work to get us to the information that we need on that retreat day.
Okay, so if I'm hearing right, if people are agreeing with Liz, what she's saying, I don't see a facilitator needed for that. I think what you're asking is two things on that retreat day, and tell me if I've interpreted wrong. You're asking that we bring people in to tell us how they have done a different kind of ways of distributing grants, some options that we may have to look at. And two, what is the state doing in a report as to what that data is and where they are? And that's what you're looking for in a retreat day, which, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure you need a facilitator to do that.
I'm trying to follow you. Is that gonna get us to helping us understand who's doing what in each of our counties? So we understand where the gaps are, what the needs are, who's already doing what. And then, I don't know where this question comes in, and how much of what's being done is evidence-based. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm trying to follow how this, I don't know how it's important. I'm just trying to think, how does the piece about how do people hand out money help us understand what the need is? It's an important piece, don't misunderstand me, but I'm just trying to get my mind around it.
For me, that's two different pieces. So one is, and I think the municipalities are probably down the line a little bit as to where we are. I think we need to know what the state is currently doing, and because they have an overview and they may know what some of the towns are doing because they support some of those towns in some of their own grant dollars. So we bring the state in, they show their data, they show where they are, they can recommend the. Then the real question, and it's a second question, is how do other organizations hand out their funding? How do they do that? So we can design for ourselves. Because the state has RFP and they do one thing. They have MEHAF who does things one way, which is a large grant. They have Maine Community Foundations, which are large foundations that have grant processes. And what are those? And what do we adopt? There's also research. Gordon, thank you very much for inviting us onto that call as to how other states are doing. I was fat and I only got to go through half of it, and I had to know how North Carolina was wonderful.
New Jersey.
in New Jersey, how they are distributing their funds. And so how, those are things that we don't have a lot of time to know. We don't want to be like Jersey or North Carolina, but they really had some interesting points as to how they were distributing their funds. And they're already in place doing it. And of course, they haven't been doing it long, so we don't know all the, the gaps that they saw. But I think I don't know if I'm answering your question, but there's two questions here. One is, what's going on around the state? And the second question is, how do we as a group distribute our funding?
Offer a suggestion. On the second point, how does this group distribute funds? At the last meeting, Ben talked about how the state gives out money, distributes money. There's rules or statutes that control how grants, how assets are distributed. And, my suggestion is, before we get into what other entities are doing or how they're doing it, if I spend some time, digging into that information, I can narrow the options for this group. And it could be that, how MEHAP does it doesn't work for this group if it's not permissible under state statute. And that might free up the group to spend more of its time on the other piece about where money is being spent and where the gaps are and what the needs are.
I really appreciate your facilitation, Pat. So I feel like we're in this infancy stage, and I like how you're taking us. So I'm not that game to have a facilitator yet, or a consultant. I think we need to talk about need. We talk some about the need. If we could just have a conversation about bringing all parts of the state to talk about what's happening out there, which will then drive, and that's sort of like then what happens probably with an RFP. There's a need that gets, then procurement puts it into a process. But I like your style. I think you have a lot of expertise. You have a lot of experience in the field. So right now, this seems really effective to me versus bringing in an outsider that we sort of go down, not the word your mouth is, but maybe a lane we don't want to go down. So, but I think if you can keep the reins and we can have a conversation about need, like a lengthy conversation, and let that begin the process.
And for me as a member, I would love if we came out of that retreat with a timeline.
You'll get us there.
I am there, I'm like, timeline. So then you can say to people when they say, oh, in end of April, RFPs will come out, or first of June, whatever. I'd just love to have that.
And I'll just mention, I think that all the public health entities across the state will have done an environmental scan and have a work plan on their prevention and some of the funding that goes towards harm reduction, which hopefully they have connected with their harm reduction partners to come up with, and that will be completed by March 1st. So I think we'll have some information there around need, right? Because they will have done some of that. And then I'm sure there are other folks within the treatment and recovery community who could very easily say where there are giant gaps, right? Including folks at this table. But I think there's like some really clear things that could get presented to the whole group, so we understand what the needs are in each of those realms.
Okay, all right. So I will figure out an agenda for about a 4-hour meeting on what I'm hearing. I'll nix the facilitator. She'll be fine with that. And at this point, what we need is a date. It's just gonna be us, so we have to find a space. But it also has to be public. So we'll get back to you, but all right. A date in March or April?
So we're based on the last council meeting, we started looking at Bangor And we're looking at some options there and getting information about schedules and costs.
They just want to lock in the date and then go to them and have them be like, we're not at the very get-go, we can't book you during that time. Or Tuesdays are already booked or something like that, you know.
April seems a long way away.
Oh, yeah,
I
no,
would
it definitely is,
much
but
prefer March,
we've had
even if it's late.
some
March.
craziness tracking down places that won't let us book.
I wanna go with what quarter.
All right,
What
we're
about
gonna-
Say, we got a sense of urgency.
okay,
Can we meet at the barn in Bangor?
Where?
the barn.
The barn?
Like at an actual.
I'm actually extremely open to suggestions, because I
So-
don't know Bangor at all.
So the barn, the only thing we discussed was, this was good, the barn has technology. So we do have that. The only discussion we had was, if we meet there in some way, here's where the conflict of interest is. If we meet there, is there some sort of conflict of interest if the barn applies for funding? And if people don't see it as again, there's a conflict everywhere we look. So, again, the barn has a conference room, they have the technology, they're centrally located, they have plenty of parking. I love the barn, I'm always happy when I'm at the barn, but that's just me, that's not everybody else. But do you see it as a potential, it's one peer recovery center in Maine, do you see that in any way as a potential conflict?
Perspective. It isn't that it is, it's just that somebody will look at it and go, ah,
Perception
it's
is
perspective,
Yeah, I mean-
perception, thank you.
Perception is.
That's the word I was.
Whether or not it's an actual conflict, I would advise avoiding it, or avoiding the appearance of a preference of some kind.
I mean, you
There's
have
a
just, sorry.
There's a couple other options that we're looking at. They will have a cost, and that can be paid for.
Morning, afternoon, raise of hands, morning? A couple morning people.
4 hours or 6, how long?
We talked about 4 hours, I could go to 6, but I think 4 was the agreement. I don't wanna get pushy.
I think
I
4
can't-
because of the travel.
4,
Yeah.
so 4 for the travel, so we could meet like at noon, go noon to 4. With a snack, we want a snack.
And a break.
And coffee.
And a coffee snack, let's see what else. I'll figure that out. So noon? No,
Noon works.
Why not noon? Sure.
all right, noon to 4. In a neutral spot, wherever that may be, wherever neutral lines. 4, I will send out possible agendas to everybody. People will give me feedback. You'll send out some dates once you find them somewhere in March. All right, in the interim, and I don't want to know whether you want to wait till after the March meeting, we talked about the starting of a conflict of interest policy, as well as we have to have a nominating committee and that would go in the new bylaws, under governance. Do you want to wait till after this retreat to do that? I mean, Brenda's gonna work on,
So I think it would be helpful if folks could consider if you are willing to serve on some of the committees that are listed in the bylaws. At a minimum, right now, there's governance, there's finance, there's, I forget what the other one is.
governance,
And the council may, can get rid of committees, it can establish committees, but at a minimum, just, think about whether you are willing to serve on one of these committees, think about whether you're willing to serve as an officer, which would be chair, vice chair, treasurer, secretary. So those are some of the roles that council needs to play.
Who will we send that information to? Right to the chair?
so we'll wait on that governance committee till we figure out the March meeting, and then by April, and again, I am under the assumption you're all willing to meet monthly until we get into some sort of cycle. I've served on committees before where what they do is they'll do full board meeting 1 month and subcommittee the next, that way people don't have to, but we'll figure that out. And eventually when we get moving and grooving, we may not have to meet as much, but I'm feeling that right now, in order to get these done, I think monthly meetings are important. I'm not seeing nodding heads, so I think that's okay. Because I don't want
Is there any way we could set a schedule for that, like I'm making this up, third Tuesday of the month?
That works for me. What would, what Courtney's suggesting is that we do like a rhythm to it. So right now, we're the third Tuesday, second Tuesday,
I'm sorry.
Let's just go with that.
second Tuesday.
I'll note that I have intermittent hospital service, so like I won't be able to. So,
Well, the next meeting will be the two. We want to be able to. Okay, so.
Will the meetings move around, or will they always be in one place?
I would love them to be in one place, but is that possible?
It's up to you.
Yeah,
To the extent it moves around, the goal would be to try to find space that is a state office that we could use and not have to pay for, or otherwise a public space that we would pay for, like a university.
Space, so,
As far as I know, we're not being charged for it.
yeah, so that would work.
We're not charging you.
So when I booked this one, they they were like, do you wanna like have a consistent?
I like
time? So
free,
they
I
were
always
very
like
open
free.
To me,
Free is
like
good.
scheduling a
So
consistent.
if the council wants to move around outside of Augusta, those are the only things that are, or
That's
at
what
least
they're
are on
thinking.
my mind is,
That's why I asked.
yeah, public, it's gotta be a public space, or open to the public.
Mhm.
And I think of universities, I think of community colleges, I think of
This
places
place,
like
the barn, is like very good rates, very open to the public, just
We
saying.
love the barn.
It's like the
Wow.
answer to my prayers right
Right.
now.
It's $10 an hour.
Yeah, it's like, or you could
Pretty
just do 100 and book like the full 6 hours, yeah.
And they have a kitchen.
And yeah,
Um,
kitchen, boardroom,
yeah.
coffee.
I would suggest until we know what we're doing and we get going, we have one meeting spot.
Yeah.
Here in Augusta, work for in the first year, and then after that, maybe getting going about the communities and whatnot, it's a good idea. PRCC, the barn, these different recovery centers, different areas, but until we can get established what's going on and having one meeting spot,
And,
probably best.
yeah, and I was like, hey, I think also too, I heard the committee saying, you know, they want to have where they get feedback from the public doesn't listen to us, but they also are able to, and so those meetings, we may be able to move around, so we have different sections, because a lot of times transportation, it's Maine, transportation is an issue, so we'll do that. So, Courtney is suggesting the second,
Actually, I'm sorry, I made that up out of my head, but
You did.
if there is like the third Tuesday of the month would actually work better. Not for you. Okay, never mind, I'll deal with the second Tuesday, I can look whatever it is that I have.
Haley, have you talked to Maine Municipal?
No?
about space.
They have a very nice one, it's gotta be probably this size, it's wired for sound and screens, et cetera.
Yeah, well,
Well, I will look into that.
that would
Thanks to
facilitate
COVID, most
outreach
places.
to their members.
So I understand that the
That would
retreat's gonna
facilitate
be-
outreach to their members.
Oh, absolutely.
the retreat is not going to be here, no.
Okay, so we are gonna move somewhere else for that one,
I think
find a
so,
different place, okay. Just making
unless
sure
you want to
I'm
be
on
here.
board.
The retreat's really just a 4-hour meeting, right?
Yeah.
It sounds better to call it a retreat.
You
I thought
won't
Yeah,
get-
it's not a fun retreat, I'll let you know that. There won't be any rope climbing or there won't be any of that. It is a working retreat. I should be careful with that. I should say that to myself, oh, retreat. No, not that kind of
We're in
retreat.
Augusta,
It's a working retreat.
second Tuesday, I'll make it.
Are we married to Tuesdays?
No?
Is
Do
that
you
the-
want, I don't know how to do
Doodle
this.
poll.
Do you know how to do?
It's the
You
only
can
way.
circulate a.
Doodle poll.
Yeah,
A
you can
doodle
circulate
poll?
a-
I can't do,
That's
can you
a good
circulate a
idea.
doodle poll to
I
everybody?
have no idea what that is, but I will
We will
figure it
talk,
out.
we will talk.
Yeah, we can-
And we'll
Yeah,
distribute
Tuesdays.
that out and that's how we'll figure it
Super
out.
easy to do it.
Okay, I mean,
You can do that, you
we
can
send
do
out
it.
surveys, I just don't know about this one.
Oh, yeah.
Doodle?
It's a doodle meeting
It helps
poll.
What is
schedule a
it?
meeting.
Even I can do a Google.
Yeah.
If I
You
can-
will love it when you
anybody
see it.
can.
I just don't know how to set them up. I can answer them quite readily. That I can. All right. We got a retreat. It's coming in March. We're, don't know the date until we know what sites are available. We've decided on 4 hours. We've decided it will be from noon to 4. Why have I lost my agenda? Here it is. Okay. All right. Sorry, Eric.
I just wanted to, I had emailed you probably a month ago about possibly going to remote, changing our remote meeting policy.
Mm-hmm,
It was certain business, some people that travel 5 hours, that do not get compensated for being here. I just didn't know if there was any more thought on that. What I heard today is some people say they're not so worried about getting to know each other, they want to get down to business. So if that's the case, why wouldn't we just do remote? Public access, excuse me, would be very simple. I don't know, I mentioned it, sent you an email about it. So I just wanted to-
At the governance meeting, we talked a little bit because, the, settlement dollars, people can't be reimbursed for being here. You can't be paid you can't be a paid person to be on the council. But when we put the wording in the bylaws, there was, one of the things at some point we have to do is have procedures. For instance, we can look at a policy of mileage being covered for people. We can look at compensations, we even talked about childcare. If your employer is not paying for you,
Can't do it.
oh, we can't do it now.
Just mileage.
So we can, so the statute that
You looked at-
codifies the council permits expenses related to attending the meeting, those basically boil down to travel expenses. They wouldn't cover things like childcare. And we're working out how we're working out how that process works, who it goes through, does it go through our office, does it go through a different part of state government? We're on the issue of trying to get the council members' travel expenses reimbursed.
Does that include hotel for people that are coming?
I don't think so, but I
I
can.
think it includes lodging
Is
like
it
if it's
lodging?
necessary.
Yeah, the
that would-
state, yeah, probably under state, if you look
Yeah,
at the
if we're
state policy,
elsewhere,
yeah.
yeah.
Is
And
this a direction, though, the state's going with not having remote or Zoom meetings? Is this sort of like aspirational to your question, Eric? Like,
Yeah.
should a couple of meetings a year be remote just because of the travel? Would that be acceptable, or?
So I need to review the statute again that permits remote meetings. In general, the feedback I've received from my colleagues who staff other committees is remote meetings make sense when everyone's remote, or when no one's remote. The worst scenario is when it's hybrid. And currently, the remote meeting policy has a preference for meeting in person. It permits circumstances where individual members can attend remotely when there's a family member they have to care for, they themselves are sick, or when they have to travel significant distances. I think there's another circumstance. But what it doesn't right now contemplate is the language it uses when the member can participate remotely when it's impractical, rather than like if there's a scheduling conflict or if it's inconvenient or things like that. And so I can look at the statute and just see, and sort of talk to my colleagues, see how much flexibility there is in the statute that governs remote meeting policies, and that's part of the FOA statute.
What I would propose was 2 mandatory meetings a year being in person, the remainder being remote entirely. I agree. It does not
Entirely
work.
remote.
Yeah, it does not work when we try to do both.
no, it's like the talking head.
Exactly.
Remember when we had the conference, everyone had the talking head in the middle of the thing. People in the meeting were fine, but you often, if you were the one on the phone, you often felt lost. And I think if there's 1 or 2 people on the Zoom and everybody else is in the room, it becomes the same thing. You forget who's up in the Zoom, and they're jumping up and down saying, I have my hand up, and nobody sees it. So, it's hard, and again, in Maine. But we can look at the policy again, and the office is looking to make sure it complies where it needs to, and we'll get back to you all on that to see the best we can. Again, we know that Maine is remote, and we know that weather's an issue. We know that all of you who are leaving your offices are taking the time to travel, and that is hard. And so we'll try to do our best to work it through. And I'm hoping through this work, we all get to know each other a little bit better, because I do think it's important to know who we are and where we come from, and the challenges and the successes we have in our lives are important. I'm looking at the time and want to be respectful of that. Any other business that you feel that you need to?
Want to make a suggestion that if we go over the hour and a half, that we take a vote on the hour and a half, and
Yes.
make a movement to move another half an hour. If not, I would say that we stick to the hour and a half, out of respect to people that may have had other meetings to do.
I served on committees before, that I find that very respectful. And it is one of those things that I think Gordon and Courtney, when we were at the governance committee, that's what we, at the bylaws committee, that's what we discussed. We really need not just the bylaws, but procedures written. And that may be something that when we write those procedures of how we conduct business, I mean, we haven't even decided, is Robert Rules what we do here? Is there another way that we make decisions? There's just so many things, and I think that kind of procedure belongs in that sort of procedural policy manual that we start developing as a group. But again, I served on a school committee that actually was the policy. If they went past 9 o'clock, probably should instill it now, that if you went past 9 o'clock, you had to vote to go past 9 o'clock.
Let's hope we don't go past 9 o'clock.
No, we're not gonna go, well, we already did go past 3. We're not gonna go past 3 or 5, how's that? Anything else to come before the committee? I thank you all for your time. The meeting is adjourned, and I thank you very much